Applause is a strange sound. It convinces us that something has ended, that a moment has been completed, that the story has reached a satisfying shape. But applause doesn't mean truth has settled. It only means the audience has agreed, temporarily, on what to feel. When the lights go down, when the cameras turn away, something else begins. Not reflection, not accountability, but continuation. This is a story that does not begin with scandal. It begins after success has already been secured. For more than 4 decades, Oprah Winfrey occupied a singular position in American culture. She was not just a television host. She was not simply a celebrity. She was not merely wealthy or influential. She became something rarer and far more powerful. She became a translator of pain. Millions of people did not come to her show to learn facts. They came to feel understood. They came with stories that had no language yet, with experiences that had never been validated publicly, with grief, shame, confusion, and longing, waiting to be named. And Oprah named them. She leaned forward. She listened. She mirrored emotion back to the speaker. In doing so, she offered something that felt profoundly humane: recognition. But recognition carries weight, because once someone helps you interpret your suffering, you often trust them to interpret the world. Slowly, almost invisibly, a transfer occurred. Empathy became authority. Presence became permission. Feeling heard became believing. Oprah did not seize power. It was handed to her by an audience grateful for being seen. And unlike politicians, doctors, or judges, she did not need credentials to hold it. Her credibility was emotional. That distinction matters, because emotional authority does not operate by evidence. It operates by resonance. If it feels true, it becomes true enough. This is not a condemnation. It is an observation. Empathy, when scaled to millions, does not remain neutral. It becomes a system. A system that decides which stories are elevated, which voices feel safe, which narratives are softened, reframed, or allowed to pass without resistance. Over time, Oprah did not just host conversations. She shaped the conditions under which conversations were understood. And when mistakes happened, because mistakes always happen, they did not land as failures. They were absorbed, rewritten as intentions, recast as lessons, reframed as part of a larger journey. The applause returned. The question is not whether Oprah Winfrey is good or bad. That is too simple, too comfortable. The real question is this: what happens when empathy becomes so powerful that it no longer answers to consequence? And who, if anyone, is left to question the storyteller when she controls the story itself? Trust does not arrive all at once. It accumulates quietly, through repetition, through familiarity, through the relief of hearing someone say the right thing at the right time. By the time we notice it, trust has already hardened into certainty. In the early years, Oprah's power felt benign, almost corrective. Daytime television had long treated ordinary people as spectacle. Their problems were exaggerated, simplified, or mocked. Oprah did something different. She slowed the pace. She asked people how things felt, not just what had happened. She treated vulnerability as something worthy of attention. and the audience responded. Not because the conversations were rigorous, but because they were intimate. What mattered was not whether a story was fully understood, but whether it was fully felt. That distinction slowly reshaped expectations. Viewers began to associate emotional intensity with truth, tears with authenticity, pain with credibility. Expertise became optional. If someone sounded sincere enough, their story did not need verification. It needed space. Oprah provided that space, consistently, reliably, at scale. And something subtle began to happen. Her role shifted. She was no longer simply facilitating conversations. She was modeling how those conversations should be interpreted. When she nodded, a claim felt validated. When she leaned in, a moment felt important. When she reacted with surprise or concern, the audience followed. This was not manipulation in the traditional sense. It was alignment. Millions of viewers learned, unconsciously, how to read meaning through her responses. Over time, this alignment produced authority. Not institutional authority, not scientific authority, emotional authority. The kind that does not argue. The kind that reassures. And reassurance is persuasive. When Oprah spoke about health, people listened, not because she presented data, but because she shared experience. When she spoke about trauma, people trusted her, not because she claimed objectivity, but because she appeared present. When she expressed concern, it carried weight, not because it was definitive, but because it felt caring. This is how influence grows without resistance. There was no single moment when Oprah became untouchable. There was no announcement, no coronation. There was only momentum. And momentum rewards confidence more than caution. As her platform grew, so did the stakes. Each story carried more consequence. Each endorsement traveled farther. Each framing decision shaped more lives. But the mechanism remained the same. Emotion first, interpretation second, accountability later, if at all. And because the foundation was empathy, criticism felt misplaced. Who questions someone who is trying to help? Who interrogates compassion? Who demands rigor from comfort? That tension, the space between intention and impact, would soon become impossible to ignore. When trust is built on feeling rather than verification, mistakes don't look like errors. They look like misunderstandings. And if every misunderstanding can be reframed as growth, at what point does power stop correcting itself and start protecting itself instead? There is a moment when confidence becomes contagious, not because it is correct, but because it sounds settled. Once that happens, doubt feels impolite. As Oprah's influence expanded, the boundary between experience and expertise began to blur. This did not happen through deception. It happened through familiarity. Viewers had watched her listen to thousands of stories. They had seen her respond to pain with care, to fear with reassurance. Over time, that consistency created a quiet assumption. If she understands people, she must understand problems. And so when Oprah spoke about health, nutrition, trauma, or healing, her words carried more than opinion. They carried permission. Permission for the audience to stop questioning. A single televised experience, an intense diet, a dramatic transformation, a personal breakthrough, could feel conclusive. Not because it proved anything, but because it was visible. Television has always rewarded what can be shown over what must be studied. And Oprah understood television better than anyone. When she framed a personal experiment as empowerment, the risks receded into the background. When she celebrated results without lingering on process, the audience filled in the blanks with hope. The message was never explicit. It didn't need to be. If it worked for her, it could work for you. That implication carried weight precisely because it wasn't argued. It was implied through empathy. But implication is powerful. Once emotion replaces analysis, complex systems flatten. Medical supervision becomes discipline. A controlled intervention becomes willpower. An exception becomes a template. And because the authority came wrapped in care, pushback felt unnecessary, sometimes even cruel. This pattern did not remain confined to personal health. It migrated. Stories involving fear, morality, danger, and salvation began to appear with increasing frequency. They were compelling. They were dramatic. They held attention. And most importantly, they fit the emotional grammar Oprah had taught her audience to trust. If someone appeared frightened enough, their story felt real. If a narrative was intense enough, it felt urgent. If a claim evoked strong reaction, it felt important. Verification became secondary. The platform itself conferred legitimacy. This is where intention and consequence began to separate. It is entirely possible to believe you are helping while amplifying harm. Entire moral panics do not require malice to spread. They require visibility, repetition, and validation. And once those conditions are met, correction struggles to catch up. Because corrections are quiet. They are slow. They are rarely emotional. They do not perform well on television. Oprah did not invent this dynamic, but she perfected it. And as the scale grew, so did the cost of being wrong. Not in lawsuits or ratings, those came later, but in trust displaced from systems designed to verify truth to personalities designed to feel true. When belief is built on resonance instead of evidence, who absorbs the damage when the story collapses? And more importantly, once an audience learns to feel certainty without proof, how do you ever teach it to question again? A platform does not argue. It endorses, silently. The moment someone is given the microphone, the audience assumes a filter has already been applied. By the mid-1990s, Oprah's show had become more than a space for conversation. It was a gate. Appearing on her stage did not simply mean exposure. It meant elevation. Guests were not received as hypotheses. They were received as signals. If someone was there, they mattered. If their story was aired, it had passed a threshold. This is how legitimacy works in mass media. Not through footnotes, through framing. Oprah did not need to say, "I vouch for this person." The invitation did it for her. The lighting, the introductions, the attentive silence of the audience. All of it suggested safety. This became especially consequential when authority figures entered the frame. Psychologists, doctors, healers, experts with titles that sounded reassuring on television. Their presence solved a problem Oprah's format had created. For years, emotion had led the conversation. Now, emotion gained credentials. When these figures agreed with Oprah's instincts, it felt like confirmation. The audience did not see two opinions aligning. They saw truth arriving from multiple directions at once. The result was powerful. Complex psychological issues were reduced to digestible clarity. Health advice became memorable slogans. Moral uncertainty was replaced with confident diagnosis. This felt helpful, decisive, clean. But clarity is not the same as accuracy. Television rewards answers that fit inside a segment. Real expertise often does not. So the platform did what platforms do. It favored voices that adapted, that simplified, that performed certainty. Over time, this created a feedback loop. Those who sounded definitive returned. Those who hesitated did not. And because Oprah controlled the environment, the questions, the pacing, the edits, the frame itself became persuasive. Guests did not debate. They reinforced. Dissent was not forbidden. It was simply inefficient. This is not about any single individual or claim. It is about a structure that converts presence into approval and approval into belief. Once that structure is trusted, it becomes self-sustaining. Even when allegations surface later, they struggle against the memory of legitimacy. They were on Oprah. She wouldn't bring them on if they weren't safe. That assumption lingered long after the credits rolled. And when harm eventually came to light, as it sometimes does, it arrived downstream, far from the original moment of endorsement. By then, responsibility had diffused. The platform had already moved on. When trust is outsourced to a stage and credibility is conferred by invitation, who carries the burden when the guest proves unworthy? And how many times can a system repeat this cycle before intention is no longer enough to explain the damage? Giving is supposed to be simple. You help. Someone benefits. The story ends cleanly. But scale complicates generosity, and power complicates intention. As Oprah's influence matured, her role shifted again. She was no longer just shaping conversations. She was shaping outcomes. Money entered the frame, not as excess, but as solution. Large gestures became symbolic acts, gifts that felt transformational, projects that promised opportunity. From the outside, this generosity appeared unquestionable. Who criticizes someone for giving? But generosity, when amplified, becomes governance. Every large gift carries assumptions about what people need, about how help should look, about which problems matter most. And when those assumptions come from far above, the margin for error widens. Public giveaways thrilled audiences. They also introduced consequences few anticipated. Tax burdens, maintenance costs, obligations disguised as windfalls. None of this implied cruelty. It implied distance. Distance between the giver's experience and the receiver's reality. That distance grew more visible in philanthropic projects meant to correct systemic inequality. Education, leadership, protection. These are heavy words. They require not just resources, but humility. Because when protection is imposed rather than negotiated, it can feel like confinement. When leadership is designed from the top down, it can silence the very voices it aims to uplift. And when systems are built quickly to avoid failure, they often overcorrect. Rules tighten. Access narrows. Control increases. What began as care can start to feel like surveillance. In these moments, criticism does not always come from opponents. It comes from those closest to the project. Parents, participants, communities expected to be grateful. And gratitude complicates dissent. If someone gives you everything, how do you say they gave it wrong? This is the paradox of benevolent power. The more generous the act, the harder it becomes to question its design. And when harm appears, through mismanagement, misconduct, or emotional fallout, it rarely fits the narrative of goodwill. So it gets reframed as miscommunication, as unfortunate circumstance, as overprotection motivated by love. Once again, intention stands between action and accountability. Oprah did not profit from failure in the traditional sense. She did not disappear when problems surfaced. She responded. She spoke. She reframed. And because her voice was already trusted, that reframing held. The story remained coherent. The giver stayed empathetic. The harm became complicated. The resolution stayed ambiguous. When generosity is powerful enough to shape lives, does it also inherit responsibility for unintended damage? And if every failure can be explained as care taken too far, at what point does compassion stop excusing outcomes and start requiring restraint? Most powerful people fear exposure. Oprah never needed to. She owned the light. When controversies followed Oprah Winfrey, they did not behave like scandals. They did not accumulate in silence. They did not wait to be uncovered by outsiders. They appeared and were immediately interpreted. By her. This is the final distinction that separates Oprah from most public figures. She was never forced to respond to the narrative. She preempted it. For decades, she had practiced a single, elegant skill, turning personal moments into teachable ones. That skill did not disappear when the questions became uncomfortable. It adapted. Mistakes became lessons. Criticism became misunderstanding. Harm became evidence of caring too deeply. And because this language was familiar, it felt sincere. Audiences had learned how to listen to her. They recognized the rhythm, the cadence of reflection, the tone of accountability without consequence. This did not require deception. It required continuity. The same voice that once validated pain now validated explanation. And explanation, when delivered with empathy, can feel like closure, even when nothing has been resolved. This is how power persists without confrontation. There was no reckoning moment, no dramatic fall, because the conditions for collapse were never allowed to form. Oprah did not lose control of her platform. She multiplied it. Studios, networks, productions, partnerships. She became structurally insulated. There was no editor to challenge her framing, no host to interrupt her, no gatekeeper left to bypass. When she spoke, the system echoed. This is not unique to Oprah. It is a feature of extreme influence. Those who control distribution eventually control interpretation. And interpretation determines memory. This is why accusations alone never defined her legacy. Not because they were false, not because they were true, but because they were narratively absorbed. They became chapters in a longer story of growth. And growth is comforting. Growth suggests direction. It suggests learning. It suggests that nothing truly broke. But sometimes, nothing needs to break for harm to persist. Sometimes, harm continues precisely because the system is stable. Because the story always has room for one more explanation. Oprah Winfrey taught millions of people how to speak about pain. She normalized vulnerability. She legitimized emotional language. She changed the culture. That matters. But she also demonstrated something more unsettling. That when empathy becomes infrastructure, it can shield power as effectively as it heals. After the applause fades, After the audience goes home, after the lesson has been delivered, one question remains. Not about Oprah. About us. When someone controls the story so completely that every outcome fits their intention, do we still recognize accountability? Or have we learned to confuse understanding with absolution?